Okay, so I wanted to hop on a little bit of a bandwagon today. I was curious to see what the best and worst books I've ever read are according to Goodreads. I'm on Goodreads now and I'm on the My Read Books page and I'm adjusting the rating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the top 10 worst books I've ever read and the top 10 best books I've ever read according to their average ratings. Obviously, this is kind of skewed because some books have more ratings than others and all that kind of stuff. So definitely take that into consideration. If you see one of your favorite books or one of your least favorite books where you don't think they should be, don't allow people's opinions, because that's really what this is, right? Don't allow people's opinions to invalidate what your feelings are. Okay, so now we're going to look at the top 10 books, starting off in 10th place, An Abundance of Catherines by John Green. This has an average rating of 3.54, which is not really bad. Some of these books have fairly okay ratings. It's just that I haven't read a ton of terrible books because I have good taste. But An Abundance of Catherines is fine. This was my second John Green book, actually, and I actually really enjoyed it. This was the first book that I read where I ever saw like a Muslim character, like a practicing Muslim character. His name was Hassan. He was the best friend. I remember his name and I don't even remember the name of the main character. I liked it enough. I don't think it's something I would love so much if I go back to now, but it's definitely an okay book and it's not as bad as people like to make it seem. It's definitely regarded as John Green's worst book, and I don't necessarily think it is. I actually enjoyed this more than Looking for Alaska and The Fault in Our Stars, like his two most popular books. In ninth place, we have Chinese Woman by John Lo Scheinborn. This is a pretty obscure novel that I read that takes place in Guyana, and it follows a man from his childhood to his adulthood. His name is Aziz, and he comes from a very underprivileged background, being Indian and Muslim and working class and disabled, and so all of that has affected his perception of the world. He's become a very insecure person because of all of that disempowerment he experiences. And because he's a man, he feels very entitled to more power and respect and regard from those around him. So it was an interesting book, but I just felt like the execution was really weird and the story itself was kind of flat. So I'm not shocked to see that here. In 8th place, we have Sheba Karim's That Thing We Call a Hat. I don't remember anything about this book. All I remember is that there was this kind of like subplot where this girl, the main character, who's like Pakistani American, was dating a white boy who was fetishizing her. And that made me very uncomfortable. Not that that was like a bad aspect to the story. I thought that was handled well. But everything else just... It didn't really leave a lasting impact on me. In 7th place, we have The Brother by Jack Harburn, one of the 3 smut books I've ever read, and all 3 of them are actually on this list. I don't really remember much about it. Then we have Lost and Found by Brooke Davis. This one takes place in Australia, and it's about a young girl who, I believe she lost her parents, or her parents abandoned her. And so she ends up being taken up by these 2 octogenarians who end up taking her on a road trip across Australia for some reason, I don't know why. Not a book that I remember greatly, but I did enjoy it. I think it was an enjoyable read. I did like the road trip element, but it just didn't leave an impact on me. I can see why it's, you know, here. The next one is The Babysitter, also by Jack Harburn. This is in the same series as The Brother, and it was also okay, I guess. In 4th place, we have Blame It on Bianca Del Rio, the expert on nothing with an opinion on everything. I can see why this is here. This is definitely not for everyone. Bianca Del Rio is a comedian. She's a drag queen comedian, most known from RuPaul's Drag Race. She's very raunchy and politically incorrect, and I usually don't have a problem with that type of humor in small doses, but when it's like, you know, an entire book full of it, it becomes too much. Number 3 is For Marital Purposes. This is a book that I really did not like. It was another one of those stories about like an Indian girl whose parents want to marry her off, but she doesn't want to get married and she wants to choose her own path, and then she ends up marrying some other guy in the end, of course. If I have to read another novel about a South Asian facing an arranged or forced marriage, I will vomit. Like, I'm so fed up of this narrative. Even though it is rooted in reality in many cases, like, I'm not saying that, you know, you can't write about these sorts of topics, but I just feel like people overdo it, and this is not the only thing that defines South Asian womanhood. The second one is Men and Masculinity by Caroline Sweetman, which I don't know why this is here, because it wasn't a bad book. This is a book that I read for school, and the only thing I could say about it is kind of outdated. It was published in 1997. It's a collection of essays from different like academics and scholars about masculinity and development, because that was a huge topic in the field of masculinity studies at the time. And Yeah, it was okay. It was helpful. I did, use some of the references in my own work, but it wasn't particularly groundbreaking or pathbreaking. I don't know why it's here. That's a 3.33 rating, so everything that I talked about was between 3.5 and 3.3. So, like, literally, all of these books are fine. They're not terrible books, according to Goodreads. They're really more middle tier. It's just that I apparently, for some reason, don't read terrible books. But, in number one place, the worst book that I've ever read that does have a 2.8 rating is none other than Rocking Randy by Bonar King. I don't know if y'all remember this book and the story that goes behind it. I was looking for some smut to read and I found this and I was like, oh, okay, cool. I completely ignored the whole Omegaverse Mpreg thing. I didn't know what that meant. And as I was reading the book, I was like, oh. I knew things got suspicious when the main character's ass started to get wet whenever he was turned on, and I was like, either I have been missing something my entire life and nobody thought to tell me about it, or he just has diarrhea. But then he gets pregnant in his ass, and I realized, oh, okay, this is an actual thing that people like. So now we're going on to the best books I've ever read. I'm going to be leaving out all of the Harry Potter books, partially because I don't want to talk about you-know-who, but mostly because they take up the entirety of the top 10 list, so what would be the point of that? In 10th place, we first have The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. I love this book. It was a fantastic story. I could see why so many people liked it, though. It was very reminiscent of a lot of the things that many of us would have read when we were young. Not me, I never used to read it when I was younger, but y'all with your little Harry Potters and your little this and that and whatever else, Chronicles of whoever. This book is very reminiscent of those types of stories. I could see why people liked it so much. It had a wonderful queer romance at the heart of it. It was just a wholesome story that lots of people enjoyed. People who read all sorts of different things hunkered down with this book and really, really liked it. So I can see why it resonated so deeply with people. In 9th place, we have Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga. This is a middle grade story that's written in verse about a Syrian girl who comes to the US with her mother seeking refuge. She has to leave her brother and her father behind, and she and her mother come when her mother is pregnant. So it's about her sort of dealing with missing half of her family and adjusting to a new environment. It was a really good and impactful read, and again, I could see why lots of people would have liked it. Next up, Homegoing by Ya Jassy. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I love multi-generational stories, and this book takes that to a whole new level. Usually with multi-generational family sagas, we follow 5 generations at most, but Ya Jassy was like, no ma'am, I'm giving you 7. We start off in Ghana with a woman who had 2 daughters who never met, who end up being separated. One would remain in Ghana, the other one would be shipped off to America during slavery. The story follows them and then their children and then their children's children, and we're following 2 different family lines across 7 generations, so that's 14 different characters. And it was so interesting to read that book because it really reminds you of where you come from, your history, and how much more interconnected you can be with strangers than you'd ever be able to realize. Sometimes I do sit down and think, I wonder, I might have a 5th cousin somewhere, but I don't know who that person is and I'll probably never meet them. I also think a lot about my ancestors and who they were, what they did, what their names were. So much of them are lost to time, but if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have existed. So these people who are very important and crucial to my existence have now been completely obfuscated from history, and I have no way. I mean, I could probably go and try to do some digging, but at some point I'm not going to know of all of them, right? And so I think that's sad, but also really fascinating. And books like this kind of remind you of those realities, and I really appreciated the story for that. Next up, we have, of course, The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Obviously, this book would be here. This is another one of those books, like House in the Cerulean Sea, like something about it just resonates with people. It was so well done. It was a great story, unforgettable characters, really, really impactful, super engaging, very enthralling, and extremely emotional as well. I did a discussion on this, which I really enjoyed, and I highly recommend that you go check it out. It was about the whole idea of Evelyn's sexuality being a spoiler, and whether a sexuality or gender identity can be a spoiler in a novel, and the sort of, discourse that we've been having around that in the book community for years. Next up, we have Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. I can see why this is here. I didn't love it, but I enjoyed hearing about his life growing up in South Africa and his experiences and stuff like that. It was a good book. Then we, of course, have The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, another book that I read a few years back and really liked. In retrospect, I don't think it's as great as people were hyping it up to be, but I think it was a bit unprecedented for its time, at least in terms of a book like this getting the popularity and marketing that it did at that specific point in time, it really changed the game of young adult literature and publishing, which is very impressive. Like any book that has reached the height of its popularity, it's gotten some critique from people who didn't quite think it did what it set out to do. And I think a lot of the discourse around it is very interesting, and I think that different perspectives have valid opinions on this novel. But overall, I really enjoyed it when I read it. When I read it, this was like a 5-star read for me. I really liked it. We have Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting by Shivani Ramlochan. This is a poetry collection that I really enjoyed. I actually know the author personally. She's a Trinidadian. I could see why it's rated high because Shivani's writing is super good. Like, she has a way with words, even if you don't exactly understand what the poem is about or what she's saying. Like, her expression of the English language is just stunning. She knows how to put a sentence together, and it truly is art. We have a couple graphic novels as well. My Brother's Husband Volume 2. I don't know why Volume 1 isn't here. I can't particularly remember what the big difference between the two is because I read them both literally at the same time, so it felt like I just read one big story. Really nice art, cute characters, a little bit sad but mostly happy. It's a manga about a man and his daughter, and he finds out that his gay twin brother, who he had been estranged from for a long time, passed away in Canada, and his Canadian partner comes to Japan to meet them for the first time. So it's about him having to confront his brother's past and his brother's life and identity, and also deal with perhaps the guilt of disconnecting with his brother. Heartstopper was okay. I didn't care for it, and I think this is a book that I would have liked more if I had just continued on with the rest of the series, but after reading the first book, I really couldn't bother. It just didn't resonate with me. I even tried to watch the show and I couldn't get more than 5 minutes in. I don't know if it's the story itself or if I just don't care for something like this. I feel like if I had this when I was a teenager, I would have loved it, but like now, it's just not something that particularly appeals to me. And finally, the best book I've ever read, according to Goodreads, is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. I mean, how could you not give this book a high rating? I think it is a very impactful story. It's obviously the story of the woman who was raped by Brock Turner. I wasn't like over the moon about it because how do you be over the moon about something like this, you know? I feel like a broken record at this point, but I can see why it's here. It's interesting because none other than maybe Homegoing and Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, maybe, I don't see any of my like all-time favorite books here. Were you shocked by any of the books that made it onto either one of these lists? I would love to know your opinions if you've read any of them. All of that being said, thank you all ever so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.